How much trust and confidence do you have in the mass media to report the news accurately and fairly? Well, that number is lower than it has been. Our update this year for 2014 is 40% of Americans who say that they have a great deal or fair amount of trust in the media to report the news accurately. That is down. Look at the long-scale trend here. It was certainly higher going back, 10 or 15 years ago. It was up routinely at 53, 54%. If you look at the data up through the first years of the last decade, then it started to come down again, and it's now settled down quite a bit lower, 40% now, and 40% 2 years ago, back in 2012. Actually, those dates are important because our analysis shows that trust in the media is actually slightly lower, at least in recent years, in those years where there is an election. Those would be years that end in an even digit. Look at the trend there. When you look at 08, and 10, and 12, and again now in 14, we find a slight dip in trust in the media. Maybe all of this has to do with all the campaigning that goes on in an election year, which depresses Americans' perceptions of how fair the media are when they report the news. This is not a great shock, but there is a big difference in perception of the mass media, bipartisanship. But what's interesting here is to look at the trends over time. The bottom line is Republicans are much less trusting in the fairness of the media than Democrats. But look how these lines diverged. If we go back into the 90s and the early 2000s, the lines were closer than they are now. Democrats generally more trusting than Republicans. But starting about 10 years ago or so, those lines began to diverge. And that's why we now have this big divide between Democrats and Republicans overall in trust in the media, even though the percentage who say they trust is down among all partisan groups. One last point, we do ask Americans whether they think the mass media are too conservative or too liberal. We have over 40% still who say the mass media are too liberal, and about 19% say they are too conservative. Those numbers change some over the years, but that gulf is something we've seen for a number of years now. I'm Dr. Frank Newport, Gallup Editor-in-Chief.